We had a wild night at the National Theatre.
One of many wild nights. We often can be seen raging around till it was a wonderful evening, wasn't it?
It was really wild in many senses. I mean, so the National Theatre has launched a new production of The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, hence the bad pun. But you cannot imagine a production that is more out there. I mean, it's so full on. It begins with Ncuti Gatwa in a pink evening frock, long satin gloves, playing the piano, which is not how I expected a production of The Importance of Being Earnest to begin. But it was quite something, Max Webster's take on the play.
He's had quite the year, Max Webster. Bookended by an extravagant take on Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, but started with... back in December 2023, Macbeth with David Tennant and Cush Jumbo, very stripped back, empty staging versus this maximalist, all in, I saw a lot of really interesting social media posts saying that this is the version of The Importance of Being Earnest that Oscar Wilde, if he was around today, would have wanted to have seen.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it, that people thought that he would have loved it, because it is very explicit. It makes as the sort of homoerotic subtext and the sense of gender fluidity completely text. It just becomes the play, which I had a certain amount of reservation about, while absolutely loving the evening and many of the performances. And it's been quite a year for Max Webster, and we're going to come on. Let's start by saying that this is the What's on Stage podcast with me, Sarah Crompton.
And me, Alex Wood.
And that we're going to come on talking about the WhatsOnStage Awards, in which Max Webster will feature. The Importance of Being Earnest is outside the voting range, but his production of Macbeth is up there.
Yes, recognised with a fair few nominations.
So yes, it has been a good year for him. And also in the middle of the year, he had The Real Thing at the Old Vic with James McArdle. See previous podcast.
Yeah, fully recommend you go back to listen to that one.
Wonderful podcast. And James McArdle was a great fan of Max and loved working with him. And I think you do get that sense with this production that there's a great exuberance to it and that people have had a good time, and that transmits across the literal footlights, because the Ray Smith design has footlights. The audience really comes along for the ride, don't they?
It's quite funny how, if you just take as an assumption that every single character on that stage is bisexual to some extent, you open yourself up to so many different interpretations and ideas that it can freewheel in any direction, and you don't really know where it's going to go, for a play over a century old that you don't know where it's going to go is actually really quite fun.
It's unbelievably fresh. I think that is undoubtedly true. And part of the freshness lies in the casting. It's got Sharon D. Clarke as Lady Bracknell with a kind of rich Caribbean accent. And she is just fabulous. I mean, I did love her most, I think. Every moment she is on the stage is completely energised. And what I particularly liked about her performance is, it seems to me, it's both radical and absolutely true to Wilde, that she gets the lines. She seems to me to live inside the lines and make you think that they have come out of her mind, which, especially with Wilde, is quite important because it's so full of aphorisms, so full of famous phrases. You want actors who can make you believe they would actually say them.
What was striking, and this is what you said in your review, is that it was reminiscent of a pantomime. And I don't think that's necessarily a negative thing, because as we discussed last week, there are some very sizable merits to the staging and the tone and the experience of a pantomime. And actually I was quite happy that the National was willing to lean into that more exuberant staging of a play that lots of people come to the National Theatre expecting to see the classics presented as the classics with capital T, capital C. But here it was very much a 2024 festive Importance of Being Earnest. In a way that did that flatten the material slightly, potentially. Did it make it a roller coaster to watch? Yes, but no one comes off a roller coaster and thinks, wow, the dramaturgy on that roller coaster was excellent. But that's not necessarily, again, if you want a great night out in the middle of winter, then it's delivering.
It's definitely a great night out, and it is being screened, which is nice because it's been screened at the NT Live in February, which will give a very wide audience a chance to see it. And that is part of what's prompted us starting this podcast with it, because I regard The Importance of Being Earnest as part of what I've come to think of as the sex education effect in theatre, which is that the first two series of Sex Education introduced me to a generation of actors who are beginning to dominate our stages in wonderful and innovative ways. And Ncuti Gatwa, obviously the Doctor Who, he is one of them. He broke out of that series with such force and brilliance and charisma that, you know, it was almost inevitable that he would go on to worldwide fame. He's part of the Vanity Fair issue cover. He's one of the 12 talents that they pick to put on their gatefold cover. And there is something absolutely mesmeric about him as both an actor and as I suspect, as a person. He dazzles, really.
I remember watching A Midsummer Night's Dream at Shakespeare's Globe, in which he was playing Demetrius, I believe, in that production by Emma Rice. And he was absolutely sensational. And then he also was in the Jubilee concert at Windsor Palace, where he was opposite Mae Mack doing scenes from Romeo and Juliet. So understood Shakespeare's lines like an absolute wizard. Incredible performer. And it's so wonderful seeing someone who cut their teeth in the theatre scene across the UK, now almost having their career supercharged by a breakout Netflix series. And it's actually a rhythm that we see time again with performers like, say, Hannah Waddingham, when they go into a series like Ted Lasso, you know, beloved within the UK arts ecosystem, but then all of a sudden become a worldwide sensation. And also someone like Kit Harington, who again had shows like War Horse that they were in. Then Game of Thrones came along and were, you know, revered across the world and became heartthrobs and were listed on all manner of lists. Coming back to the topic of sex education, we have to shout out the casting director, Lauren Evans, who was the one who assembled that original cohort of company members in sex education, because ultimately, even though you think it's an Asa Butterfield-led series, because he's sort of like the initial protagonist, over the course of those seasons, it really does become an ensemble-led show, and every single character within that show gets their own storyline and gets their own moment in the spotlight. And because so many of those actors have cut their teeth and continue to cut their teeth on stages, it's a very wonderful reciprocal relationship, because they go on sex education, they amass this beloved fandom that they adore and who adore them in turn, and that fandom is willing to come and support them when they come out and do stage productions, as we've seen with The Importance of Being Earnest, which is completely sold out. And I know that's partially also the Doctor Who effect, but I think that sex education sits at the heart of where Ncuti Gatwa's journey has started, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think it does draw attention to the point that a casting director is so crucially important. I've always thought I'd be a really poor casting director, because I always feel that I'm not a great spotter of talent, and that possibly isn't true. I'm full of admiration for casting directors, because they are willing to slog round theatres and small spaces in the dead of winter, late at night, seeking out people that they think will be good. And even in an age where a lot of casting is done with self-taping and different things, the really, really good casting directors are the ones who are still seeing a young generation of actors. They're going to the drama schools, they're looking to see who is out there. And I think they are amazing. And I think I used to have a friend, well, I still have the friend, but she used to be casting director for The Bill, which in the 90s, 2000s, I've sort of lost track of when it was on. It wasn't so much sex education because it didn't shoot people to stardom, but it was the basic bread and butter living for a whole generation of British actors. And it used to be funny going to the theatre with her because everybody knew her and would come up to her and say, oh, thank you for giving me my start, because basically it paid the rent, I think, the Bell, for most people. And, you know, the casting directors do. I always look in a theatre programme to see who's cast something. And I think Lauren Evans, you know, if you look at the moment, so I'm just going to list them and then we'll talk about what they're doing. Amy Lou Wood, Connor Swindles, Patricia Allison, Ncuti, Tanya Reynolds. I mean, it's extraordinary.
It is truly probably one of the most impressive feats of casting, and the fact that all of these people love the theatre, which is brilliant for us as an industry, that they are looking for those projects on stage, even though, you know, they could easily have just somersaulted off into another TV series or two.
And they are doing that.
As they are doing.
Yeah.
In a way, what we've kind of got is, because it takes a bit longer for TV projects to find their feet and to do their casting, we've got this window of about a year or two where they're waiting for those TV projects to start so they can actually jump in to do something on stage in the meantime, to just sort of wait for their sort of moment, like Amy Lou Wood, for example, who is about to be in The White Lotus, and she was wonderful in Living, the film with Bill Nighy. Was also, to be honest, my favourite Sally Bowles in Cabaret at the Kit Kat Club, for which she won a WhatsOnStage Award.
Yeah, and before that was just astonishing in Uncle Vanya, directed by Ian Rickson, in which I think she was one of the best Sonias ever. And just broke your heart. And that's a great range of work for a young actor. And it is that sense that people are making mixed careers that's so exciting. Tanya Reynolds, who I actually saw in the audience at the Orange Tree the other night, was at the Orange Tree in Richmond doing She Stoops to Conquer, which is the Olive Goldsmith play, rarely performed, giving a completely sort of modern and wonderful interpretation of a difficult part. I mean, you know, the sexual politics have sort of counted against the role of the innkeeper's daughter. And she was wonderful in that, and also in A Mirror, which was one of my favourite and most undervalued plays of last year, I felt. And she's about to be in The Seagull at the Barbican with Kate Blanchett, Tom Burke. So that's just thrilling, really. I love the idea that we're just seeing them again.
It's funny when you can look at someone like Amy Lou Wood's theatre credits before Sex Education. So she was in The Brilliant Downstate at the National Theatre in quite an important but supporting role. And then TV series happens, and then now it's, you know, the most important roles in the show. So it's the Sally Bowleses and the Sonias that suddenly are where she's allowed to position herself. So it's someone that doesn't have that moment in the spotlight until a TV series allows that to happen, but also there's that big audience draw that can exist.
And that's what was wonderful about Ncuti Gatwa in The Importance of Being Earnest. You feel him drawing his fans into the production as well. And, you know, it is easy for these older plays to be dusty and regarded as not really worth seeing, and the fact that he's there and he almost literally draws you in, because he's as Algernon, one of the two men leading a double live, he is very collusive with the audience, and there's kind of a sense of saying, come with me on this journey, which I liked very much in it.
Yes, and it felt like almost at times he was this trickster jackal presence on stage, and he would have these wry asides and he'd wink to you and you'd sort of be like, oh, we're one of Ncuti's friends in and sort of like, you know, it did actually, like you say, blow those cobwebs completely off the text, and it felt like it was fresh and new and original. And I think we see that time and again when a new bunch of talented performers come through that feel like they have the agency to take old texts and bring something new to them, because they're also bringing an audience to those plays. And I think directors can recognise audiences want something new or different, and they don't want something that feels stately and old-fashioned. So that feels really exciting.
Yeah. And it'd be interesting to see Asa Butterfield, in fact, is a child of TV rather than stage in terms of his casting as the lead in Sex Education. And yet he's coming he's making his stage debut
Yes.
in a new play by Barney Norris shortly, which is interesting as well, because that's bringing in a younger audience, and the theme of the play is also going to attract people, because it's about a brilliant theme about the person who didn't get the role of Harry Potter.
Brilliant. I didn't know if there's anything semi-biographical about that at all, because I also know that Asa Butterfield was quite a prolific child star in his own right, because he was in films like Hugo, the Scorsese film that's much loved. So does that allow him to lend a bit of authenticity to, the world of screen and those near misses and those horrible opportunities, sliding doors-esque opportunities that you do or don't get?
It's got a horrible title because it's called Second Best, which of course is where you just don't want to be.
Just to give a very personal anecdote, I was auditioning for the school production of Sweeney Todd in secondary school. I was in year 10. I was quite a baby-faced year 10 person. Not that you could ever imagine me like baby-faced or anything. And there was 2 of us left to audition for the role of Toby. And it was between myself and this guy called Tom. And we both did Nothing's Gonna Harm You from Sweeney Todd. And then as I was walking out, I remember it clearly to this day, the teacher's notes saying good but not as good as Tom, and like those words are etched into my brain. I think that's like, probably you could dissect all of my drive as a professional comes from that feedback that I was never meant to read, that I just saw on a notebook as I was walking out of a room.
That is crushing.
Yeah.
The funniest comedy show I ever saw was the one that made Jack Whitehall a star, which of course was about him being second best at school to Robert Pattinson. And the effect on his psyche of knowing however good he was at anything, acting-wise, he would never be as good as Robert Pattinson, and turning it into this hysterical tour de force of anxiety and anger and disappointment. It was, there's no doubt that Jack Whitehall, at some levels, owes his success to venting about being second best to Robert Pattinson, because it was the most extraordinary comedy show.
I'm going to pull off a segue, and I know we love segues on this podcast.
We're trying hard for segues.
We are. Well, this one is going to be so natural. I don't know why I even signposted it. But talking about rivalries, friendships, and plays involving people you know when you're younger, one of our favourite plays was Red Pitch at the Bush, yes, and then at Soho Place in the West End. And Keeda Williams-Sterling, who is also a sex education star,
indeed,
was brilliant in that. And again, I remember him talking about moving from TV to the stage, and how the stage and that live cauldron that Red Pitch as a play created was so rewarding. And TV, as many performers have told us, can be quite a sterile environment, because you get the setup, you do a few seconds of clip, and then you move on. And it's rinse and repeat every time. But actually, when you're on stage, that live magic allows you to flex so many different muscles over the course of a few hours, rather than the same muscle for many hours, time and again. So he was another one I really wanted to foreground, because he was so good in that play. They all were brilliant in that play, and I think that's one of the best plays of really this century.
Yeah, loved it. Absolutely outstanding play. And yes, thrilling to see him and all of them. And hats off to casting directors, which takes us very neatly into the WhatsOnStage Awards, because one of the many wonderful things about the WhatsOnStage Awards, not to blow its trumpet, is that it does have an award for casting directors. And it's a recognition of their key importance to productions. And the list of nominees is so brilliantly wide-ranging, because it goes from The Years, which is the adaptation of Annie Ernaux, which was at the Almeida and about to transfer, and which gathered 5 completely contrasting actresses together to tell the story of one woman's life, which, when you try and describe it, always seems so complicated, and yet it is effortless. It's an astonishing piece of work, and I'm so glad that it's having a second life in the West End.
What's always struck me about casting direction, and I think sex education exemplifies this, is that you don't really judge someone on which star they've got in the lead role, but actually how have they formed the connective tissue around an ensemble so that everything feels consistently impressive. And I think the Years is a case in point in this. And running through the other nominees, I feel like it's an election time and we're having to run through all the candidates for a specific constituency. But, you know, shows like Till the Stars Come Down, huge ensemble efforts. Macbeth at the Donmar and in the West End, yes, you've got David Tennant and Cush Jumbo as the two leads that get a lot of the oxygen, but actually it's the space around them that really feels more interesting and exciting, and the world of Scotland that Max Webster has put together using the sound and also using the ensemble that allows Tennant and Jumbo's performances to really be catapulted into something beyond. Yeah. Then you've also got A Raisin in the Sun, which you adored.
Yeah. Lorraine Hansberry is just one of those writers that you feel the sense of waste and loss because she died so young and she was so important. And to have a national tour so beautifully cast of a seminal play and giving people an opportunity to see something that really would be in danger of being lost and yet still speaks so strongly to so many people's experience, I think is wonderful. And also Fiddler on the Roof, which I had my socks knocked off by the ensemble. It's absolutely what you say. I mean, of course, you know, the stars of it were great, but really what was wonderful about that production was that you had a sense of a whole village. And, you know, people always say it takes a village to make a child, it takes a village to make a production. And there you are, you've got a whole village on stage, everybody beautifully represented, each single person differentiated but cast as an ensemble. And that is what I think is you're absolutely right, it's a casting director's ability with the director and with other people, but to see the way that something will end up, to see the texture of a piece that is so important and generally I think undervalued. So hooray for the WhatsOnStage Awards.
Yes, I won't wax lyrical about too many of them specifically because I don't want to influence anyone's decision making now that the voting has opened. It was striking taking the overall assortment of nominees, how the musical revivals, including Fiddler on the Roof, were the shows that really led the charge. So, you know, you've got Starlight Express was out top with 9 nominations, but then Oliver at 5 and Fiddler at 5 were the 2 follow-ups in terms of the musical side of things. And then on the plays, you've got The Artist, Macbeth and Spirited Away were the sort of leaders there. And for me, what's really wonderful is that how many of those shows that performed strongly didn't originate in London and actually further afield. So venues like Nottingham Playhouse, between the new revival of Dear Evan Hansen and Punch, have had a really wonderful year. And then Theatre Royal Plymouth, you've got The Artist, Drew McOney's brilliant version of the hit film, and The Devil Wears Prada, which has now transferred into the West End but cut its teeth in its original preview run in Plymouth. So 2 of these regional venues are sort of really chomping at the bit in terms of wanting to provide audiences with new and exciting plays that they wouldn't see necessarily in the West End, or might be crowded out in the West End, but get given these long and healthy runs and that actually do find themselves a future life. So Punch, for example, is now transferring into London at the Young Vic. Dear Evan Hansen is continuing its huge tour. Devil Wears Prada has now opened at the Dominion Theatre, and I imagine The Artist is going to have some future life, given how well it's been received.
And that is the wonderful thing about, as advocates of regional theatre and people who saw a lot of their initial theatre in the regions, what is so great about the WhatsOnStage Awards is that recognition of the liveliness of regional theatre and the range of work that's being put on there. And, you know, in every category, there are Birmingham's represented, Sheffield's represented. But also it's nice that London is actually waiting to see things. You know, I'm waiting to see Punch because I didn't manage to get to Nottingham. I'm definitely waiting to see The Artist. All producers out there, please. And I think that's a sign of a healthy theatre ecology that London isn't. Everything. And it is the great thing about the awards that they're recognising this range of experience that's available.
One of the 2 changes we did this year for the categories, because we like to shake it up every year and reflect the state of the industry and how things might be altering or changing, was we introduced the wigs, hair and makeup category, which is really wonderful, but also we've altered the best off West End category to be a best studio production category, because we were noticing quite often there would be shows that would open in smaller venues across the UK, so might not have had the thousands of bums on seats that certain regional productions would get. So they'd open in smaller studio spaces at subsidised venues. So by the time they've actually amassed a bit of oxygen and a following, they would no longer be eligible for the WhatsOnStage Awards because they've had that initial run. So we wanted to acknowledge that fact by adjusting one of our existing categories to allow regional venues with smaller shows to get a bit of momentum behind them, so that they can actually campaign. So you get shows like Ken Rex, which is on in Sheffield, now getting a nomination. I think we've spoken about that on a previous podcast for our autumn preview. But it's so lovely now to know that, yes, that show is probably going to have quite a long life, but it didn't forfeit its opportunity to be recognised at the WhatsOnStage Awards because we've opened that category. And I think half of that category now are shows that were in London or are currently in London, and half of that category are shows that have never played in London and probably never will. So that's really lovely, again, to show that the regions, as you say, are kind of where it's all happening, and London might be 6 months behind where some of those latest innovations are taking place.
It's the plus size of award seasons, because it is an interesting thing that all awards are, of course, divisive and difficult, and that people never quite agree on every award that's given. But I remember talking to somebody who was doing an Oscar campaign for quite a small film, and they made the point that it's not just about the award or winning it, but it is about drawing light to things that are sometimes overlooked. And it is gratifying, I think, and why I like awards. I mean, I always have this kind of endless argument with my husband about award ceremonies because he can't bear it. He's always going, oh, how can you watch this? But I love it because it is a way of shining light on good performances, good contributions, a range of talent, a range of plays. And I really love the spotlight shining on small things that I won't have seen and that I'll go and see as a result, whether they're movies or whether they're plays, because, you know, it's hard to get publicity for those things. People don't have loads of money to spend. So to have an audience that think you're good, or an industry that thinks you're good and rewards you, that's really nice.
The audience side of things is particularly interesting. You know, it's certainly something that, you know, that there are some brilliant people that have performed that aren't on that shortlist, and you wish you could sort of give them some sort of special award, but then you think, okay, well, I spent a large portion of the year championing them via the podcast or on the website or with a review. So the awards sit as part of a portfolio of celebration. And I think that's the only way that I can mentally deal with it, is that just because they don't pick up an award on the night or because they don't make a shortlist doesn't mean they're not being celebrated by WhatsOnStage throughout the year anyway.
Yeah.
But to your point, it is also great to see nominees in categories like Best Professional Debut or Best Studio Production that then can go on and have bigger lives after their nomination, and you feel as though you were a stepping stone towards wherever they end up. I remember looking back, and this kind of brings it to the sex education point. I think one of our best newcomer winners was Ruth Wilson back in the early noughties for one of her stage performances, and now, you know, one of the biggest TV and film exports the UK's seen.
All awards are voted for by people who care. I think that's the quality. And I think one of the qualities of the WhatsOnStage Awards, which are the only awards are voted for by the members of the public, people who care and who pay their money to go to the theatre are actually also casting their votes. And the amount of care is reflected in who wins and who doesn't, I guess. But that caring, I think, is of value. And I you know, as I say, all awards are flawed at some levels because the people I think should win don't always win. So obviously there's something wrong with that. But nevertheless, it's a really great spotlight on an industry and on the widest possible range of that industry. And the fact that, you know, touring shows do get so well recognised is terrific, because they don't really get recognised in that many other awards ceremonies, which I really like.
I think it's very tricky, especially now, and we've discussed this on other podcasts, to get out into the regions as a critic. So having the regions shouting at you saying this show is amazing, with thousands of people logging in, submitting their nomination, submitting their vote. Like you say, it sort of tethers you to these spaces that you might not be able to reach physically.
And it's not just social media that's having that effect,
No.
is it?
So I was mulling over this recently because this is my 8th WhatsOnStage Awards. So I've essentially now done a third of all of the WhatsOnStage Awards that have happened in some form or another. So my first one was when I was a lowly editorial assistant and sort of running around trying to assist the wonderful team that had been doing this for years and knew what they were doing. And I was sort of like a rabbit in the theatrical headlights. But now, having spent a few years looking at the data and looking at how the votes have cast, what I've noticed is that actually there does seem to have been a shift in the behaviour of the nominating public and the voting public, in that previously there'd be a lot of influence from social media, which obviously there still is to some extent, but as social media platforms become a bit more wary of sending their users to publisher websites, so they'll want to keep their users on their own app. So a Facebook algorithm will try and keep its users on Facebook rather than pushing them away to WhatsOnStage. Instead of it being social media driven, a lot of the time it's mailing list driven. So venues will campaign and put out the nominations or the shortlist to their mailing list and say, hey, look, XYZ at our venue has been nominated, please go and vote. And that feels like it's a lot more of a surefire way to guarantee people will come to your website or come to our website and vote. So that shift has been really fascinating as more venues get behind the awards and start tapping into their loyal fan base and their members and asking them to vote. It's a whole different system to when it was just who was the most popular person on social media that year.
Yeah.
Obviously, social media, as I say, still plays a role. But actually, we've noticed as more and more venues get on board with it and put a bit more weight behind the campaigning process, they see a few more results, which is wonderful because it, again, shows these regional venues that have that loyal following are willing to follow through and support when it comes to things like the WhatsOnStage Awards.
Yeah, that's really interesting because that is, theatre goers, and that, that's lovely. I always forget this. I'm always the person in the WhatsOnStage team who's getting a phone call the week before saying, so are you actually coming to the awards? Because I managed to forget. What's the sort of next stages?
Yes.
When do we vote and everything?
So I've tattooed this onto my forehead so I don't forget. Voting is now open as of yesterday because we announced the shortlist with the wonderful cast of My Fair Lady at Curve Leicester.
Oh, which has had wonderful reviews. And
reviews.
I'm looking forward to seeing that because I like a good My Fair Lady.
And I love Nikolai Foster and everyone at Curve. Yeah. They are the epitome of brilliant regional venues supporting their areas. So, voting is now open. It will close on the 9th of January. After that, we spend a month essentially tallying up all the votes, getting everything ready, and preparing for a very glitzy concert at the London Palladium on the 9th of February. Tickets are still available for that, where we sort of crown all the winners and we have some exclusive performances and some surprise appearances. And it becomes essentially a big night to celebrate everything West End, everything regional theatre, and everything that makes us love this theatre community. And again, we've been doing that concert for many years, but last year, or earlier this year, I suppose, was the first year we've done it at the Palladium.
Which is quite something.
Yes, I did not have co-producer of a concert at the London Palladium on my expectations by the age of 30.
Life is always throwing you curveballs. Brilliant.
Start by reviewing shows at Shoreditch Town Hall and end up co-producing concerts at the Palladium, but it's nice that I can do both those things, and that's really lovely, and I can still go back to those 50-seater shows and celebrate the next generation of talent that, come 2030 might be winning WhatsOnStage Awards after their Netflix series, which might be the next Sex Education. So yes, it all comes full circle, I guess. Beautifully
brought to an end. I think you're getting very good at these segues. I'm quite impressed. So I'm sure we'll be reporting much on the WhatsOnStage Awards, along with the plays at Shoreditch Town Hall and other venues in subsequent podcasts. But for now, I think it's probably time to say goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.
And a goodbye from me, Alex Wood. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, and leave a comment wherever possible. We will be back every Friday with a new episode, and there'll be a smattering of bonus episodes to watch out for in the meantime.